12 ships. 12 wooden ships, anchored in the dark, rocking gently in the cold water of the Myeongnyang Strait. Behind them, nothing. No reinforcements, no reserve fleet, no grand strategy from the capital. Just the Korean coastline, and beyond it, a nation on its knees. Ahead of them, over 300 Japanese vessels, 133 warships, backed by 200 supply and transport ships. An armada so vast that when it moved, the sea itself seemed to change color. Tens of thousands of battle-hardened samurai and sailors, fresh from destroying the Korean fleet just weeks before. They had already won. Everyone knew it. The war was over. Korea was finished. Everyone knew it except one man. He stood on the deck of his flagship, the only ship that would move forward when the order came. His name was Yi Sun-sin. He was 53 years old. He had been stripped of his rank, arrested, dragged to the capital in chains, and tortured until his body broke. He had lost his mother during the chaos of war. He had been given command of a fleet that no longer existed, and he had written, in a letter to the king who had nearly killed him, a single line that would become the most defiant sentence in Korean history. I still have 12 ships. You may have seen the movie, Myeongnyang, the Admiral Roaring Currents, released in 2014, 17.6 million tickets sold, the most watched film in Korean cinema history. By ticket sales, no Korean film has ever surpassed it. Not a superhero film, not a romance. A movie about a middle-aged man standing on a boat, waiting to die. Korea watched that movie and wept. Not because it was sad, though it is, but because every Korean already knew the story. They had grown up with it. Yi Sun-sin is not a historical figure in Korea the way, say, Nelson is in Britain or Washington is in America. He is something deeper, something closer to the bone. He is the proof that one person, abandoned by everyone, betrayed by their own nation, can still refuse to surrender. But the movie, as extraordinary as it is, only shows you the climax, the final impossible battle. It does not show you how Yi Sun-sin got there. It does not show you the decades of failure and stubbornness that forged him. It does not show you the turtle ship, or the string of victories that should have made him untouchable, or the betrayal so petty and so complete that it nearly destroyed Korea itself. The real story is longer, darker, more painful, and more impossible than any film could capture. This is not a legend. This is not mythology. This happened, and it begins not on the sea, but in the mountains, with a boy who could not stop failing. He was born in 1545 in Seoul. He came from the Yangbon class, Korea's aristocratic elite, but his branch of the family had fallen on hard times. They had status, but not wealth, a name, but not power. In Joseon-era Korea, there were two paths for a young nobleman. The civil service exam was the golden road. It led to positions at court, to influence, to real power. Every elite family poured everything into preparing their sons for it. The military exam was the other path, the lesser one. Soldiers were necessary, but they were not respected. Yi Sun-sin chose the military. Even as a young man, he had a quality that would define his entire life and ultimately destroy him before it saved him. He was incapable of dishonesty. He could not flatter. He could not play politics. He could not smile at a man he despised and pretend to agree. In a society built on hierarchy and the careful management of appearances, Yi Sun-sin was a disaster. The civil service, a world of alliances, patronage, and the art of saying one thing while meaning another, would have eaten him alive. The military, at least, had a use for stubbornness. But even there, the path was brutal. In 1572, during the mounted combat portion of the military exam, his horse threw him. He broke his leg. Any other man would have withdrawn. According to the accounts passed down, Yi Sun-sin stood up. He took a willow branch, stripped the bark, and splinted his own broken leg. Then he walked off the field under his own power. He failed the exam. He passed 4 years later, in 1576. He was 32, ancient for a new officer. His career began in remote frontier posts on the northern border, fighting Jurchen raiders in frozen mountains. And it was there that the pattern of his life took shape. He was ferociously competent. He won skirmishes other commanders lost, but he refused to credit his superiors for his own work. He refused to ignore corruption. He filed honest reports. In Joseon, Korea, honest reports were a form of suicide. He was demoted, stripped of rank, forced to serve as a common soldier. He endured it without complaint, and when reinstated, went back to doing exactly what he had always done, his job, without compromise. By 1591, Yi Sun-sin was 47 years old, with almost nothing to show for 2 decades of service. Then, through the recommendation of Ru Sung-rong, a childhood friend who had risen to high office and who recognized the extraordinary mind beneath the stubbornness, Yi Sun-sin was appointed naval commander of the Left Jula province. He arrived at his new post in the spring of 1591. He had 14 months before the largest invasion in East Asian history would crash against the Korean coast. 14 months, he spent every single one of them getting ready. In those 14 months, Yi Sun-sin did something that would change naval warfare forever. He built a dragon, the Gubok-sun, the turtle ship, the most famous warship in Korean history, and possibly the most misunderstood. Western accounts have called it the world's first ironclad. Popular culture sometimes depicts it as a medieval submarine. Neither is accurate. But the truth is extraordinary enough. Here is what Yi Sun-sin was facing. Japanese naval warfare was based on boarding. Their ships would close fast, grapple alongside, and send waves of samurai swarming onto the enemy deck. Man to man, sword to sword, the Japanese infantry was among the best in the world. If they got onto your ship, you were dead. Yi Sun-sin needed a ship that could not be boarded. The turtle ship was roughly 100 to 120 feet long. Its defining feature was the roof, a heavy curved covering over the entire upper deck, reinforced with iron spikes. From above, it looked like a turtle, low, rounded, armored. The spikes made boarding suicidal. A samurai who leaped onto the roof landed on a bed of iron points. And even if he survived, there was no hatch, no way inside. The crew was sealed beneath the shell, working oars and cannons in the dark. The ship carried between 20 and 30 cannons, firing from both sides, the stern and the bow. And the bow was something else entirely. A dragon's head. Carved and painted, the dragon head was functional. It projected smoke, sulfur-based compounds that created a thick, choking fog. Some historians believe it could also fire cannons through the mouth. Imagine what that looked like from a Japanese vessel. A spiked shape emerging from a wall of smoke. Fire erupting from a dragon's jaws, cannons roaring from every side. And no visible crew. No one to shoot at, no one to fight. Just the ship itself, moving through the water like something alive. But the turtle ship was not invincible. It was slow, suffocating for the crew, expensive to build. The exact number of turtle ships Yi Sun-sin built remains debated. Some records suggest as many as 24, though the typical deployment was likely far fewer. The turtle ship was a spearhead, not the whole weapon. His real genius was how he used all of his ships together. Fleet tactics, tidal knowledge, the discipline he demanded from every captain. These were what made him unbeatable. The turtle ship was the symbol. Yi Sun-sin's mind was the weapon. He completed the first turtle ships in early 1592. Drilled his crews until they could load and fire in the dark. And on May 23, 1592, the Japanese came. Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the warlord who had unified Japan after a century of civil war, sent 158,000 troops across the sea. 700 ships. Korea was not a destination. It was a stepping stone. Hideyoshi's real target was Ming China. Korea was not ready. 200 years of peace had rotted the army from the inside. Officers appointed through politics, soldiers barely trained, coastal defenses that existed mostly on paper. The Japanese landed at Busan on May 23, 1592. The fortress of Dongnei fell in a single day, overrun in less than 12 hours. The defenders fought to the last man. It made no difference. The Japanese advanced north at terrifying speed. Sengoku veterans carrying arquebus muskets in enormous numbers, weapons Korean soldiers had barely seen. The Korean army shattered on contact. Seoul fell in less than 3 weeks. King Sunjo fled in the middle of the night, abandoning his people. The common folk of Seoul, watching their king run, broke into the palace and burned it. For a brief, terrible moment, it seemed like Korea would simply cease to exist. But at sea, something different was happening. Okpo, June 16th. Yi Sun-sin found a Japanese transport squadron anchored off the coast. He attacked. 26 enemy vessels destroyed. 0 Korean losses. Sachun, July 8th. The first deployment of the turtle ship, Yi Sun-sin lured the Japanese out of a fortified harbor with a feigned retreat, then turned and attacked. 13 ships destroyed. Dongpo, Donghongpo, Yulpo. Through June and July, Yi Sun-sin swept the southern coast like a fire through dry grass. Each battle the same: meticulous planning, devastating execution, 0 losses. And then came Hansundo. August 14, 1592. Yi Sun-sin's masterpiece. He lured 73 Japanese warships into open water using a small decoy squadron. 5 or 6 Panaksun that feigned confusion and retreat, drawing the Japanese away from the narrow coastal waters where their boarding tactics were strongest. The Japanese took the bait. They surged forward, hungry for an easy kill, and sailed straight into the open sea south of Hansundo Island. Then Yi Sun-sin's main fleet appeared. From behind the island, from hidden anchorages along the coast, Korean warships emerged and spread into the crane wing formation, a wide curving arc, like the wings of a crane opening for flight. The tips of the wings extended forward on both flanks, and the center held back slightly, creating a crescent of overlapping cannon fire with no blind spots and no escape route. The Japanese sailed into the center of the crescent and realized, too late, that they were surrounded. Cannon fire erupted from front and both sides simultaneously. Ships that tried to turn were raked along their hulls. Ships that tried to charge were met by the turtle ships at the center. Armored, spiked, pouring smoke and fire. 59 ships destroyed, 12 captured, thousands of Japanese dead. The exact toll is debated, but the scale of the devastation was beyond question. Yi Sun-sin's losses, negligible. The psychological impact rippled far beyond the battle itself. Japanese sailors who had fought at Hansundo carried the terror back to their fleet. The Korean ships that appeared on the horizon were no longer simply the enemy. They were something worse. Crews that had eagerly boarded Korean vessels at the start of the war now hesitated. Some refused to sail south. The fear of Yi Sun-sin became as potent a weapon as his cannons. The Japanese naval commander Wakisaka Yasuharu, who barely escaped Hansundo with his life, reportedly described the battle as unlike anything he had ever experienced. The defeat was so complete that Japan effectively abandoned its plan to control the Western Sea route. Hansundo broke Japan's control of the sea. Their army could no longer be supplied through the western route. The invasion had a fatal weakness, and one Korean admiral was systematically dismantling it. By the end of 1592, Yi Sun-sin had fought more than 10 major engagements, the first in what would eventually become 23 consecutive victories across the entire war. He had not lost a single one, not a single ship. And after every battle, every burning wreck, every body pulled from the water, he sat in his cabin and wrote it all down. Ship counts, ammunition expended, weather conditions, tidal patterns. The names of officers who fought well and those who did not. Yi Sun-sin kept meticulous records of every engagement, not for glory, but because precision was the only language he trusted. In a war where everything else was falling apart, Yi Sun-sin was the only thing standing between Korea and annihilation. And for this, he would be punished. There is a pattern in human history that repeats so often it feels like a law of nature. The man who saves the nation becomes the man the nation fears most. Yi Sun-sin's victories made him a hero to the common people. Fishermen sang his name. Refugees told stories of the admiral who could not be beaten. And that was precisely the problem. King Sunjo had fled his capital, abandoned his people, and spent the war begging the Ming Dynasty for help. His authority was in tatters, and into this toxic atmosphere, Yi Sun-shin's fame arrived like a flame in a room full of gunpowder. A commander that popular, that independent, what if the people loved the admiral more than the king? In the paranoid logic of Joseon court politics, excellence was indistinguishable from treason. And then there was Won-gyun. Won-gyun was not entirely without ability. He had commanded ships in the early battles. But where Yi Sun-shin was methodical, Won-gyun was reckless. When the Japanese invaded in force, Won-gyun had panicked, scuttled his own ships, and fled to Yi Sun-shin for help. And Won-gyun was a politician above all else. He knew how to whisper, how to flatter, and he was consumed by the specific, corrosive jealousy of a mediocre man watching a superior one receive the recognition he believes should be his. Won-gyun wrote to the court, claimed credit for battles he barely participated in, implied that Yi Sun-shin's independence was disloyalty. The Japanese, meanwhile, played their own game. A double agent named Yoshira fed false intelligence to the Korean court. A fabricated report that Yi Sun-shin should sail to a specific location to intercept a Japanese fleet. It was a trap. Hidden rocks, ambush forces. Yi Sun-shin knew it was a trap. He refused the order. In February 1597, he was relieved of command, arrested, dragged to Seoul in chains. The man who had saved Korea's navy, bound like a criminal, and paraded through the streets. He was tortured. The bastinado, repeated beating of the shins and feet with wooden rods, designed not to kill, but to break, to reduce a man to something that would confess to anything. Yi Sun-shin did not confess. He had nothing to confess to. There is a particular loneliness that belongs to men who are right when the world insists they are wrong. Yi Sun-shin had refused an order because he knew it would destroy the fleet. He was correct. He had the knowledge, the experience, the evidence, and none of it mattered. The court had made its decision, and the court's decision was that obedience outweighed competence, that a man who disobeyed a suicidal order was more dangerous than the enemy itself. In his cell, beaten and bleeding, Yi Sun-shin carried not only the pain of the torture, but the heavier weight of knowing, with absolute certainty, that the nation was destroying itself, and that he was powerless to stop it. He was sentenced to death. Only the intervention of court officials who recognized the insanity of the situation urged the king to spare him, arguing that executing Korea's only competent admiral during an ongoing war was beyond reckless. The sentence was commuted. He was stripped of all rank and made to serve as a common foot soldier. The man who had never lost a battle, carrying a spear in the infantry, and Won-gyun was given command of the fleet. What happened next was inevitable. Won-gyun took command of the Korean fleet in the spring of 1597. He had approximately 160 warships, a rebuilt force that represented years of effort and resources, the last meaningful naval defense Korea possessed. Won-gyun was not a commander. He was a catastrophe with a title. He drank heavily. He failed to maintain discipline. He ignored intelligence reports. He mistreated his officers and his sailors with equal contempt. The fleet that Yi Sun-shin had built into the most effective fighting force in East Asia began to rot from the inside. The Japanese, sensing the change in Korean command, launched their second invasion, the Jung-yu War, in 1597, and this time they went for the navy first. The Battle of Chilcholang, August 28, 1597. Won-gyun, pressured by the court to produce results, sailed his entire fleet into a Japanese trap in the narrow waters near Guje Island. It was exactly the kind of mistake Yi Sun-shin would never have made, committing the entire force without reconnaissance, without a plan, without understanding the terrain. The Japanese fleet surrounded the Koreans. The battle became a slaughter. Nearly the entire fleet was destroyed, all but 12 ships. The fleet Yi Sun-shin had built, the one that had kept Japan from controlling the sea for 5 years, was gone in a single day. Thousands of Korean sailors died. Won-gyun himself fled ashore and was killed by Japanese soldiers while trying to escape on foot. Korea's navy, the only thing that had kept the nation alive, no longer existed, except for 12 ships. 12 ships under the command of Bae Sol, a subordinate who had disobeyed Won-gyun's orders and kept his small squadron out of the disaster. 12 battered, undersupplied warships, all that remained of Korea's naval power. The court panicked. The king panicked. court officials who recognized the insanity of the situation urged the king, the only thing that could be said, bring back Yi Sun-sin. Shortly after the disaster, Yi Sun-sin was reinstated as naval commander. He traveled south to take command of what was left. Imagine what that journey was like. Weeks on the road, moving through a country being ravaged by a second invasion. Towns burning, refugees on every path, families carrying what they could, the roads littered with the debris of a civilization coming apart. Yi Sun-sin walked through all of it, seeing with his own eyes the cost of what the court had done. And during those dark weeks of marching south, he learned that his mother had died. She had been ill for some time, and the turmoil of the war, the news of her son's arrest, the invasion tearing the country apart, had taken the last of her strength. Performing funeral rites in the dirt of a country at war. He rose. He kept walking south. And somewhere ahead of him, 12 ships, and the knowledge of what he was being asked to do with them. He arrived. He inspected the fleet. He assessed the situation with the same cold precision that had always defined him. And then he wrote to the king, the same king who had imprisoned and tortured him, the same king who had replaced him with the man who destroyed the fleet. The scene must have been something to witness. A man who had been beaten, stripped of everything, who had mourned his mother on the march to a war he had been dragged back into, sitting down with brush and ink, writing not with rage, not with accusation, but with the calm, measured clarity of a commander stating facts. His letter contained a line that would outlast everything else, every battle, every ship, every political intrigue of the entire war. Shinagenen, ajik yaldu chokwi bega nama idsapnida. Your Majesty, I still have 12 ships. Not a complaint, not an accusation, not even a request for more resources, just a statement of fact and a promise written between the lines. I have 12 ships. I will fight with 12 ships. I will not surrender. The court had considered dissolving the navy entirely and reassigning the remaining sailors to the army. Yi Sun-sin's letter stopped that discussion cold. He followed it with a second statement that has become almost as famous. If the sea route is left open, the enemy will use it to attack Chungcheong and Jula provinces along the coast and reach the Han River. As long as I live, the enemy shall not be safe on the sea. As long as I live. October 26, 1597. The Myeongnyang Strait. The strait is narrow, barely 1,000 feet across at its tightest point, where the waters between the Korean mainland and Jindo Island compress into a channel that amplifies the tidal currents to extraordinary speeds. Every 3 hours, the current reverses direction. At peak flow, the water moves at over 11 knots, fast enough to make navigation almost impossible for large ships. Yi Sun-sin had studied this water. He knew it the way a hunter knows the ground where he has set his trap. The Japanese fleet, 330 ships carrying over 20,000 men, entered the strait from the south. Their commander, Kurushima Michifusa, was confident. He had numbers that made the battle's outcome a mathematical certainty, 12 against 330. There was no tactic, no formation, no genius that could overcome those odds. But Kurushima did not understand the war, and he did not understand Yi Sun-sin. Yi Sun-sin positioned his 12 ships at the northern end of the strait, where the channel was narrowest. In this choke point, the Japanese numerical advantage was meaningless. They could not spread out, could not flank, could not bring more than a handful of ships to bear at any time. The wide ocean, where 300 ships could swarm a smaller force, was behind them. Here, in the strait, they would come in single file. But even with this advantage, the odds were absurd. 12 ships could not hold a strait against 330 for long. Eventually, the sheer weight of numbers would push through. Yi Sun-sin knew this. He had one more factor in his plan, the current. The battle began in the morning. The tide was flowing south to north, pushing the Japanese ships forward into the strait. They came fast, driven by the current and by their own aggression, and Yi Sun-sin sailed forward to meet them, alone. His flagship moved into the strait ahead of the rest of his fleet. His other 11 captains, terrified, paralyzed by the scale of what was coming, hesitated. Yi Sun-sin's own war diary names captains who held back. Some, the records suggest, refused to advance outright. Others simply could not bring themselves to move. Yi Sun-shin's flagship engaged the Japanese vanguard by itself, for what survivors later described as an agonizing stretch of time. One ship fought the entire forward element of the Japanese fleet. Cannons firing, arrows falling like rain, the flagship taking damage, the crew struggling to reload, the Japanese closing in from every side. According to the accounts of the battle, Yi Sun-shin stood on the deck, visible, deliberate, refusing to take cover. If his men could see him standing, they could not justify hiding. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the other Korean ships began to move forward. Shamed by the sight of their commander, fighting alone, pulled forward by something deeper than courage, they entered the strait, one by one. And then the current changed. The tide reversed. The water that had been carrying the Japanese ships forward now began to drag them backward. Their formation, already compressed and chaotic in the narrow strait, fell apart entirely. Ships collided, oars tangled, the current spun vessels sideways, exposing their hulls to Korean cannon fire. Yi Sun-shin had timed it. He had known, to the hour, possibly to the minute, when the current would turn. He had fought alone, long enough for the tide to turn, because he needed to hold the Japanese in the strait long enough for the sea itself to become his weapon. Kurushima Michifusa, the Japanese commander, was killed. His body was pulled from the water by Korean sailors, and his head was raised on a pike on Yi Sun-shin's flagship, visible to every Japanese ship in the strait. The Japanese fleet broke. 31 Japanese ships were destroyed. Others were damaged beyond repair. The remaining ships retreated south, out of the strait, and did not return. Korean losses: 0 ships sunk, a handful of casualties, 12 ships against 330, and the 12 won. Historians have debated the exact numbers for centuries. Some Japanese accounts place their fleet at a lower figure, perhaps 130 combat ships, with the rest being supply and transport vessels. Even at those reduced numbers, the Battle of Myeongnyang remains the most lopsided naval victory in recorded history. But the numbers, in a way, are beside the point. What happened in that strait was not a battle. It was a man refusing to accept reality, and reality bending to accommodate him. That night, according to his diary, Yi Sun-shin did not write about the victory. He wrote about the supplies he would need for the following day. The war ground on for another year after Myeongnyang. Yi Sun-shin rebuilt the fleet, slowly, painfully, recruiting sailors from fishing villages, repairing ships with whatever he could find. By late 1598, he had over 80 ships, supplemented by a Ming Chinese naval squadron. Toyotomi Hideyoshi died on September 18, 1598. The invasion lost its purpose. The Japanese were ordered to withdraw, but Yi Sun-shin would not let them leave quietly. The Battle of Myeongnyang, December 16, 1598, the final engagement of the 7-Year War. A combined Korean-Chinese fleet intercepted the Japanese withdrawal force of 500 vessels in the Myeongnyang Strait. The Japanese were trying to go home. A pragmatic commander might have let them go. Yi Sun-shin attacked. The battle raged through the night. Ships burned. The water turned black with smoke. And in the pre-dawn darkness, as his flagship pressed deep into the Japanese formation, Yi Sun-shin was struck by a bullet beneath his left arm. He fell. His son Yi Hui and nephew Yi Wan rushed to his side. According to the accounts of those present, Yi Sun-shin looked at them, lucid. He understood what was happening. His final order: Nawi Jugamu Ali Jimara. Do not announce my death. Yi Wan covered his uncle's body with a shield, beat the war drum himself. The fleet fought on, not knowing the man who led them was already gone. Yi Sun-shin died on December 16, 1598. He was 53 years old. The battle was won. The war was over. Korea survived. After the war, they found his diary, the Nanjung Ilgi, the war diary. It is not only a military record. It is the private journal of a man carrying the weight of a nation with no one to share it with. He writes about battles, yes, ship counts, supply shortages, but he also writes about missing his mother, about worrying that his sons are not eating enough, about nights when he cannot sleep because of the sounds his wounded men make in the dark. His diary is full of entries about sleepless nights, about the moonlight on the water, the sound of waves against the hull, the weight of silence when the fighting stopped. He wrote about beauty and sadness in the same breath, because for Yi Sun-sin, they were the same thing. And there is another entry, harder to read. While Yi Sun-sin was at sea, his third son, Imjin, was killed by the Japanese. The news reached him by messenger, a small piece of paper that unmade the world. He wrote of his son's death in an entry so brief, it reads like a man unable to bear writing more. A father at war, learning that the country he was fighting to save had already taken his child from him. What kind of man was Yi Sun-sin? Not the bronze statue in Gwanghwamun Square with the sword raised to the sky. The real Yi Sun-sin wrote about moonlight on the water and nights he could not sleep. He wept when his mother died. He wept when his son was killed. He worried about his soldiers' rice rations. On the night of his greatest victory, he wrote not about glory, but about supplies for the next morning. He recorded the weather, the tides, the small details of daily life aboard a warship, because the small things were the only things he could control. He was not a god. He was a man, stubborn, principled, politically disastrous, lonely, afraid, who fought anyway, who stood on the deck of his ship watching 300 ships come toward him, and did not turn around. Not because he was brave, but because turning around was not something he knew how to do. After the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, the Japanese Admiral Togo Heihachiro was compared to Yi Sun-sin. Whether the famous quote attributed to him that Yi Sun-sin was too great for any comparison is authentic remains debated. But the sentiment is shared even among those who fought against Korea. Some legacies are simply beyond dispute. The story of Yi Sun-sin is the story of a nation that tortured the only man who could save it, and a man who saved it anyway. 12 ships in a narrow strait, a current that changed, a man who stood alone because no one else would stand with him, a diary full of sleepless nights and moonlight on the water, a father's grief written in a diary entry too brief to bear, a letter to a king who did not deserve it, and a final order, spoken with a bullet in his chest: do not announce my death.